the longer that we have it, the harder it is to change because that pain actually becomes part of our identity and part of our life. Hey guys, Greg Chaplin here, physical therapist and strength and conditioning specialist. And as someone that suffered from chronic pain for more than 10 years and beat chronic pain, I'm going to try to explain to you in this video how chronic pain is keeping you in your comfort zone, and that in order to beat chronic pain, you need to get out of your comfort zone. So we're going to talk all about how chronic pain keeps you in your comfort zone. We're going to explain what chronic pain is, and then we'll spend the rest of the video talking about the cognitive, behavioral, and emotional tools that you'll need to be able to break free from that comfort zone and to beat chronic pain. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So what is chronic pain? So we all know what pain is. Pain is a protective response from the body that happens when there's some sort of an injury or threat to the body. So we're all familiar with an acute type injury where, let's say we get a cut, we realize that there's some bleeding, and then the brain sends a pain signal down and says there's something wrong there, we need to protect that, and then we go get our Band-Aid, we heal up, and it's all good. Now with chronic pain, it's not quite like that. What happens is maybe there's an injury that happens, maybe it's something that comes on gradually over time, or maybe it's something that happens during a stressful time in our life. But that pain comes and often it doesn't go away. And so this is still a protective signal. So if we can think of it in these terms, this is really the brain's attempt to send us a signal of protection to alert us to some danger. Now the only problem here is that in chronic pain, the vast majority of the time, there's no identifiable physical structural issue. So yes, you might have some positive imaging, but those imaging findings are usually considered normal or incidental. And this can actually be kind of infuriating because the pain is very real. This is a very real signal that's coming down from the brain through learned neural pathways that's alerting us to danger. And having that imaging actually might feel kind of good if it's got some positive findings because it lets us know that there's something wrong there. But in most cases, even if we have some structural abnormalities that are considered normal or incidental, those are usually not the cause of the pain, but instead the pain is caused by these learned neural pathways that are just trying to protect us. Now, how might you know if the pain was structural or if it was this type of chronic pain that was from a learned neural pathway? So there's a lot of ways that you can tell this, but one of the surefire ways is if the context itself, but not the activity, changes the pain. So I'll give you a quick story here. So I bought this chair behind me, which would be considered like an ergonomic chair. So I'd get up from this chair and I'd go, oh, wow, I feel so great. It must be the chair. Because I'd go to work at the clinic and I'd sit in a different chair and my neck and my back would absolutely be killing me. So one day I walk into work, they changed the chair to this exact chair. I think they got it like at the same sale. And I know that this chair is great and I feel really comfortable in it. And it's a very ergonomic kind of chair. And I assumed that the difference was actually the chair itself. But then what happened was I actually sat in that chair at work and I still had discomfort in my neck and back, whereas at home I was sitting in the same chair and didn't have any discomfort. So the difference there was not the activity itself, it was actually the context. So we want to think about that. If it was a structural thing and the physical environment was actually affecting it in a direct way, it would not be different sitting in the same chair in two different places. But the fact that I was in work and it was a stressful situation versus working from home doing something that was a lot more fulfilling, that difference in context made that threat detection system come online a little bit more at work and come offline a little bit more at home. And that was the difference in the pain. Okay, so you might be wondering, how does chronic pain keep you in a comfort zone? So when we're looking at chronic pain and we're looking at what these underlying factors are, there's a lot more than just the pain itself. So oftentimes chronic pain is tied up in all sorts of things like our identity, our self-worth, the way that we behave and interact with the world, as well as past emotional issues that are often deeply rooted in childhood adverse experiences or trauma or interpersonal relationships, especially those within our family systems. So what we want to know is that our body is just trying to protect us. It's just trying to send us a signal that something's wrong and it needs us to take some action. But taking action might require us to actually do something radical, like giving up our sense of self. And that is a big change. Or we might have to change where we live or what our relationships are, or the way that we think about ourselves, or the way we think about our past. And those things are all very uncomfortable. So the pain is actually this very comfortable place to be, because even though the pain is physically uncomfortable, we know what that pain is and we know that we can deal with it. Even if we say things like we can't deal with it, it's actually very familiar to us. And the longer that we have it, the harder it is to change, because that pain actually becomes part of our identity and part of our life. So instead of addressing those things that might be contributing to the pain, sometimes it's just easier to live with the pain. And I know this was certainly my experience. I became very used to being the person who was in pain. And even though I desperately wanted that pain to go away, I didn't know how resistant I was on the subconscious level to doing all the necessary work that had to be done in these different domains that we'll talk about in a second in order to actually get that pain to go away. Because remember, this pain is just alerting us to threat that's going on in our system. So that can be mental, emotional, spiritual, or physical. So we're going to go through each here now and give you some examples of how this can be addressed and how we can get you out of your comfort zone. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so starting with the cognitive aspect. So the first thing we need to understand is that this pain is probably not structural. So if we can't accept that, it's really actually kind of hard to get off the ground with a lot of things, because we're always going to have that fear and worry in our minds that something is physically wrong with us. So we need to get ourselves educated on this. We need to understand chronic pain, where it comes from. We could be reading journal articles, we could be reading books. So if you want some book recommendations, just go down below and I'm going to put some links in the descriptions. But just off the top of my head, some of my favorites right now would include Unlearn Your Pain, Howard Schubner, and The Way Out by Alan Gordon. Really easy read. That's probably a great one to start with. But just getting educated on pain, where it comes from, and what chronic pain is a great way on a cognitive level to start to understand that these are probably not structural issues. There's probably nothing physically wrong with the body, even though we are experiencing pain, which is very real. Now, another thing we want to think about on this cognitive level is how we're just addressing pain and how we're addressing everything in our lives in general in terms of how we're thinking about things. So if we're tending to be the person that worries, we're tending to be the person who puts too much pressure on ourselves, or we tend to be that person who's criticizing ourselves, this can all increase our perception of threat within our system. So we want to take a step back and we want to look at how are we treating ourselves in terms of our self-talk. So are we being self-critical? Are we putting pressure on ourselves? Are we putting pressure on ourselves to get out of pain? Because this is like creating threat when the problem comes from threat itself. So we want to just look at how we're doing things, and we want to think about dealing with ourselves the way we would deal with someone that we really like or we're trying to help, or even like a child. We want to treat ourselves in this gentle, sort of compassionate way. We want to start to develop this self-compassion over time. Now, going along with that is trying not to be so dependent on the outcome. So a lot of us are doing exercises and we're hoping that afterwards our pain's going to be gone, but we often are watching in a very intense way to see what our response is to these activities. So we're thinking, okay, I did this activity. Did I get better? Did the symptom go away? And when we're watching the pain like a hawk and we're being very intense about it, we're also communicating threat to the body. So if we can exercise in this way where we're not worried about the outcome, but we're just happy and appreciative that we're doing this activity that we know is good for us, that is a way to be outcome independent, and that reduces that threat and actually increases the probability that that exercise is going to be effective for us. So that's very counterintuitive, because we want to make sure we're doing things correctly and we want to make sure that we're doing the right things. But often that self-pressure and that worry and that focusing on the outcome is actually just creating more threat. So you want to be very gentle, open, curious, and light with the way that you're approaching things, especially in regards to exercise. Now, another cognitive trick is to use signals of safety. So when we think about doing a movement that we're afraid of, like we're bending forward if we have back pain, for example, if we can send ourselves signals of safety while we're doing the activity, or just recognize that there's fear or anxiety present when we're doing the activity, this is a cognitive strategy for communicating to our body that there's no reason for us to worry. These are just false alarms. We can use mantras like that. We can say, these are just false alarms. This is a protective signal coming down from the brain that's trying to help me. There's nothing physically wrong. And over time, sending yourself these signals of safety in these activities or positions that might otherwise trigger symptoms can help communicate to the brain there's nothing wrong, and that can actually help restructure the neural pathways to develop new pathways instead of just using those old pathways of learned pain. Now, the last cognitive strategy that I'll share with you is one that I would say is a little bit more advanced and has to do with mindfulness practice. So in mindfulness, and I've talked about this in another video, maybe I'll link that up here, is that a lot of us are thinking all the time without actually knowing that we're thinking. So if our thoughts in a chronic pain state are all about how the pain's not going to get better and how we're doomed and how there's something wrong with us, and then we're completely identified with that thought, so we think we're the same as those thoughts, then we really get stuck in this rut of identifying identifying ourselves as being the person who's in chronic pain. This is one of the worst things you can do. I did this for a long time. And so a really good, powerful, easy way to step out of this once you figure this out is to realize that you're not the same as your thoughts, regardless of if those thoughts are positive or negative. So if you can use mindfulness to notice your thoughts as just appearances in consciousness rather than being the same as the thoughts, that's going to help you separate from that. And the better you get at that and the more often you can actually do that and separate from that, the more you'll realize that you are not the same as your pain, and that a lot of the suffering that's associated with the pain is not from the physical sensations themselves, but actually from the way that you're addressing this from a mental standpoint. And so if you even look through the literature, you'll see that there's this phenomenon called cognitive fusion, where people that are in chronic pain, they tend to identify as being the same as their thoughts. So their experience is fused to their thoughts, and they're filtering everything through thought. That is something we want to learn how to disconnect from if we want to get out of our comfort zone and cure ourselves of chronic pain. Okay, so now moving on, we're going to go to the behavioral intervention. So this is all about changing habits, really. And so starting with just the basics, we want to make sure that we're doing things that help regulate our physiology. So that's going to be things like exercise that's within a tolerable limit for us. So anything that feels safe and that we're able to do and doesn't provoke pain, that's a good place to start. We also want to try to get good sleep, whatever that means for you, typically 7 to 9 hours, go to bed at the same time each night, limit screen time before bed, those kind of things. Try to wake up at the same time, limit caffeine after 12 in the afternoon, all those good things. But again, even with those sleep things, we're just trying to make incremental changes. So don't think you have to do this all at once. So we had the food, we had the sleep, we have the exercise. Those are kind of like the big three. We can do that, and a little bit of mindfulness. That's a great place to start. There's also some other behavioral strategies that we can use as well. So now just on a life participation level, we can look at a couple things like, so if we're out of work, we need to get back to work in a way that makes us feel fulfilled. So a gradual return to work. I was actually out of work for the better part of 7 or 8 months at the worst of my chronic pain. And actually just getting back to work was really actually empowering. I was able to do it in a very gradual way. And this can be really, really useful, a little bit scary at first, but useful. Now, the thing that goes along with getting back to work is you get these social interactions going that are actually crucial when it comes to pain. So I'll just say a quick thing about this real quick. So when we think about chronic pain, usually what we have is some sort of an imbalance going on in the nervous system. So often we have a ramped up fight or flight, or we have a ramped up freeze response, depending on your individual response. So you could actually be someone who's very much exhibiting this increased alertness and stress, or you could be someone who's just completely shutting down. But neither of those is a very healthy nervous system response. What we can see is very beneficial to help that good part of the nervous system, that parasympathetic nervous system, to act in a healthy way, is to actually get social engagement. So when we look at the vagus nerve, which is the most important nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system, if that nerve is acting without social engagement, it will tend to act in more of a shutdown kind of way. But if it's acting with social engagement, it will actually give us that benefit of being able to help us rest and recover. So we want to think about using social engagement, just hanging out with people that we feel safe around, that we can connect with. We want to use that as a powerful tool to regulate our autonomic nervous system. Now, last but not least, and probably most important, is just gradual exposure to things that are challenging for us or trigger us. So if there's a particular place that triggers us, or there's a particular activity that triggers us, we want to find a way to gradually over time expose ourselves to that situation. So for me, I had a lot of dizziness issues, a lot of cognitive perceptual issues. And so in the beginning, I wanted to avoid things like grocery stores because, quite frankly, they just give me a headache and make me feel really bad. But then over time, those actually became the activities that I had to get more and more comfortable doing. Now, the caveat is this: you don't want to do too much too fast. And while you're doing those activities, you have to do them with the mindset of lightness and curiosity and acceptance. So even if you're getting some increase in symptoms while you're doing those activities, you want to think about where those symptoms are coming from, right? These are protective mechanisms. They're there to keep you safe, but they're just false alarms, right? You don't actually need them to keep you safe because you're already safe. So you're using those cognitive strategies while you're using the behavioral strategies, and you bring those two together to get that powerful reprocessing of pain to alter those neural circuits. Okay, so in this last section, we're going to talk about what's often most challenging but most important for a lot of people, which is the emotional side of things. So the overarching theme here is that if we have emotions that are unprocessed or unrecognized, that can actually manifest in the body as physical symptoms instead. So this could go anywhere from muscle tension, headaches, fibromyalgia, to IBS, to migraine, to cognitive perceptual issues, disorientation, even weakness of limbs. So this can manifest in a lot of ways, but the underlying mechanism as to what's going on in a lot of cases is going to be that we have emotions that are unprocessed or unrecognized, and instead the body produces these physical symptoms instead. So the fix here is going to be to recognize those emotions accurately and to be able to actually embody them. So there's a number of ways that we can achieve this, and let's just go through a couple of the more simple ones first, and then we can talk about some of the methods that are out there that you might utilize either by yourself or working with a licensed mental health professional. So when it comes to the easiest things you could do is just develop some emotional awareness. So if you're someone that knows you have a pretty low level of emotional awareness, you might just start to look through emotional terms and start to look at definitions and put together what the difference between certain words are. And that could actually be really useful. And even something like reading fictional literature, which if you're someone like me, you probably don't like to do, it can be really useful as well because you'll start to learn what these different emotions are. And sometimes just being able to learn what they are helps you to identify them. If you can identify them accurately, your body might not produce those physical symptoms. Now, another relatively easy to do from a logistical standpoint, but sometimes hard to do from actually getting out of your comfort zone standpoint, is expressive writing. So expressive writing, if you look through the literature, is really beneficial for both mental and physical symptoms, but there are a couple of key factors here. So what we want to make sure is that we're doing this for at least 20 minutes continuously. We want to have a certain amount of time to recap our thoughts. And while we're writing, we want to focus on the emotional content of what we're writing. So we don't want to just write about events as just the nuts and bolts, but we want to focus on what we're feeling. And then most importantly, we also want to look at is we want to write about the most traumatic experiences in our lives. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, but what they find in the literature is that when we write about the most traumatic experiences in our lives, that's where we get the most benefit in terms of the physical and mental improvements that go along with it. So there's a real easy prompt that I'll link down below that's in an article that goes through all the benefits of expressive writing. And there's a little box there that gives you a general prompt that can be used. And if you want further help on this, the book Unlearn Your Pain by Howard Schubner has a section in it that goes over what's called ISTDP, or intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, which is actually bringing you through the identification of different emotional subcategories that are often associated with chronic pain. And just one note about the emotional work here. So if you're someone who's suffered significant trauma or has what would be considered to be very primitive defenses, such as that immobilization response that we mentioned, those cognitive perceptual issues, disorientation, weakness, fainting, those kind of things, you might need to work with a mental health professional because oftentimes what you have is an inability to mobilize those underlying emotions and tolerate that unconscious anxiety. And a lot of times that will just kick the defense mechanisms in a little bit stronger if you're not able to deal with them in a skillful way. So you'll probably have to deal with bringing in those cognitive and those behavioral strategies, even working through exercise to establish this sense of grounding so that when you do mobilize those emotions, you're able to deal with them in an adequate way. So that's something that could be achieved by working both on the movement side of things, but also working with a licensed mental health professional as well who can guide you through that process. Okay, guys, so there you have it. We talked about how chronic pain can keep you in a comfort zone. We gave you some tools and some strategies. So if you have any questions, go ahead, leave them down below in the comments. If you like this video, like it, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you really thought this video was useful, you can help grow the channel by sharing this with someone who's in chronic pain who you think could benefit from this video. And until next time, thanks a ton for watching. Peace.